Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book our review today is Of Human Bondage. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of Human Bondage with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself, if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. Of Human Bondage is a novel by the English writer Somerset Maugham, and together with Razor's Edge considered his best work. As I mentioned before in other reviews, for me Maugham is one of the greatest British writers and represents a period, the first part of the 20th century, that produced some of the greatest British novels. Maugham was a very pragmatic and very profound observer of the human animal. He possessed the gift of keen observation with a very English sense of humor, and together they make the reading of his novels pleasant and easy, a genuinely enjoyable experience. And many of them, back in the 20th century, were adapted into films and radio programs. Unfortunately, today, most young people are not familiar with Maugham's writings, which is the case with the vast majority of the great 19th and 20th century literature. What is Of Human Bondage about? It is about the formation of the human animal, more psychological than physical, but the two are relative to and conditioned on each other. It is individual life from childhood to the age one can safely assume he had become a functional adult, usually around 30th birthday, and it is a long and even painful journey. The secret to life is meaningless unless you discover it yourself. A bit of the plot. The story starts with the protagonist, Philip, 9 years old, and witnessing his mother's death. A few months after his father died, he goes to live with his childless uncles and later is sent to a boarding school. He has a handicap, a club foot. It makes him shy and insecure when interacting with other boys, and in general his life more difficult. It is an illusion that youth is happy, an illusion of those who have lost it. But the young know they are wretched, for they are full of the truthless ideal which have been installed into them, and each time they come into contact with the real, they are bruised and wounded. Philip has an opportunity to attend Oxford, but instead decides to go to Germany, where he enjoys himself for a while. Later, he is convinced by his uncles to come back to England, and he returns to London to try to learn some useful profession. But the experience is rather disappointing, so he moves to Paris and decides to become an artist. Unfortunately, he seems to lack talent and believe in himself, so he returns to London to study medicine and become a doctor like his father. In the city, Philip meets an ambitious waitress, Mildred, and that's when his real problems and education began. His life becomes a roller coaster, struggling with poverty, deceptions, and emotional hardships, most of it as a consequence of his friendship with Mildred. But eventually, some type of order emerges, and it creates some hope for the future. And that's the basic plot. What are my thoughts about Of Human Bondage? It is a great novel about growing up, highly autobiographical. The protagonist, handicapped, orphaned as a child, interested in art but choosing medicine as a more practical profession. It all kind of says young Maugham and his experiences. The book seems to be divided into 4 naturally occurring parts of life. The first part is childhood, then adolescence, pre or young adult, and finally reaching adulthood. Childhood is marked by innocence, lack of understanding and comprehension of the deeper meaning of the events transpiring around you, what kind of effect on your future life present events will have. Basically, you are exclusively living in the present, enjoying or not the moment. Philip forgot his tears and grew excited at the thought of his approaching journey. We start to learn about the pain of loss. Some get a lot more of it than others, like the protagonist Philip. Maybe the child's short attention span and memory is there to help him survive the initial shocks. At this stage, the focus is on basic survival to arrive at the next stage. Philip learns to read, which is another tool to help diverge attention and get over, forget some painful experiences. It allows one to create a different world, a temporary place of escape. Insensibly, he formed the most delightful habit in the world, the habit of reading. He did not know that thus he was providing himself with a refuge from all the distress of life. He did not know either that he was creating for himself an unreal world, which would make the real world of every day a source of bitter disappointment. Next come adolescence, maybe the most important period because it has a crucial impact on the rest of our lives. We realize that there are consequences and that we carry some responsibility for what will happen to us in the future, and also what we might want our future to be like. And after experiencing the pain of loss in childhood, we start to learn not to get too attached. There is a great Buddhist mantra that relates to this. When you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. When you meet your ancestors, kill your ancestors. When you meet a disciple of Buddha, kill the disciple. When you meet your father and mother, kill your father and mother. When you meet your kin, kill your kin. Only thus will you attain deliverance. Only thus will you escape the trammels of material things and become free. In this stage, Philip is in the boarding school for the first time on his own, and he is introduced to the interspecies competition, learning to deal with his peers. Adolescents can be quite direct and vicious, and if you, like Philip, have an obvious physical impairment, life can be brutal. But this will teach you a lesson that can be useful in the future. Maybe there's a way for life to make the ones that are physically weaker psychologically stronger. The good thing is that over time, people who are around you will become accustomed to your oddities and abnormalities because we get bored and need novelty in our boring lives. But Philip's school adventures show there is always one persistent, sadistic monkey that will not let it go. This is one more lesson for the future, this one on how to deal with hostile individuals. Further, in this stage, we began to look for solutions to some of our more visible, basic problems. Philip's biggest wish at this time is to be physically normal, to correct his handicap, and he turns to religion, which seems to offer the quickest and easiest solution. But as usual, it is a disappointment. He had learned already that in the Bible, things that said one thing quite clearly often mysteriously meant another. Another development of adolescence seems to be finding role models. Well, we might have some in our childhood, invisible friends and the characters from fairy tales, but the new ones are more real, inspiring us to give a more realistic look at our lives, and even we might be introduced to somebody in whose footsteps you would like to follow. For Philip, it is the new schoolmaster, who is young and more progressive than the rest of the faculty. His biggest gift to Philip might be making him more accepting of his handicap, even seeing it as an advantage, or more as a guidance for his future. Of course, Philip is a teenager, and this means rebellious and naturally resistant to taking advice from adults, so he decides against the advice of studying at Oxford and instead goes to Germany, maybe to put some distance between himself and the memories of childhood suffering. Philip has occasional doubts about his decision, but his pride would not let him admit it. Like all weak men, he laid an exaggerated stress on not changing one's mind. The move to Germany for Philip is the beginning of the young adult period, becoming more independent when we start to make conscious efforts to form ourselves into somebody we would like to be. He felt like a man who has leaned on a stick and finds himself forced suddenly to walk without assistance. It really seemed as though the days were colder and the nights more solitary, but he was upheld by the excitement. It seems to make life a more thrilling adventure. And in a little while, the stick which he had thrown aside, the cloak which had fallen from his shoulders, seemed an intolerable burden of which he had been eased. And at this stage, we start to recognize and reap the fruit of our childhood and adolescent experiences, making conscious efforts to amend some of the earlier damages or letting them define the rest of our lives. We realize that it is better to forget some events from our past, if possible, or accept them for what they were, learning experiences. We began to see life from a more practical perspective, a relative event, and we accept limits in things like religion. And from that, he led him to admit that the Mohammedan and the Buddhist were convinced also of the truth of their respective religions. It looked as though knowing that you were right meant nothing. They all knew they were right. Also at this crossroads of adolescence and young adult, Philip has his first sexual adventure with an older woman, another learning experience, Miss Wilkinson, who according to Philip is a full-figured, meaning fat and not very pretty. She seems conscious of it and says Englishmen are stupid because they only look at the face, but the French appreciate the full figure. And Philip read some French novels, and because of it he feels he qualifies as a Frenchman. His hormones are acting up, and when his aunt said Miss Wilkinson is 37, he convinces himself she cannot be any more than 26. But the day after, his urge temporarily satisfied, he cannot believe she is less than 40. This is Philip's first taste of the opposite sex, women seen not only as people, but women seen as potential sexual partner. Perhaps the urge started in the earlier part of the adolescence, but now we realize it is not a temporary entertainment, it is an integral part of life. Of course, there are disappointments, but fortunately there are plenty of fish in the sea, more for some than others, because there are social limits to our desires and ambitions. What do you suppose I care if I'm a gentleman or not? If I were a gentleman, I shouldn't waste my time with a vulgar slut like you. Another thing that we usually discover in this period is our talents and passions, things we might consider dedicating our lives to, and for Philip it is painting. Unfortunately, he is insecure about his talent, and being English, thus very pragmatic, he is not willing to risk his future for something that might not bring any material benefits. So Philip's education continues, formal, but the more important one is the indirect life lessons. Some of it comes from casual conversations, usually with older individuals, and a lot of it are just opinions, so you must know how to separate what and how it might be useful in your life. You know, there are two good things in life, freedom of thought and freedom of action. In France, you get the freedom of action. You can do what you like and nobody bothers, but you must think like everybody else. In Germany, you must do what everybody else does, but you may think as you choose. They are both very good things. I personally prefer freedom of thought. But in England, you get neither. You are grounded down by convention. You can't think as you like, and you can't act as you like. That's because it is a democratic nation. I expect America is worse. I think this is very much Mom's opinion about the world. The national differences, usually unseen or unperceived, even going against their common beliefs. Mom, after spending the early years in England, a lot of it spent abroad traveling, and a few short stays in the US, has settled on the continent in the south of France, where he spent the rest of his life. I guess he didn't have much appreciation for the Anglo-Saxon democracy, or found it too restrictive for the type of lifestyle he enjoyed. Philip stays in Paris, learning to paint, trying to decide if this is something he can dedicate his life to, and also he's enjoying the city. Through descriptions and reflections, it shows the author's appreciation and preference for Paris and France in general. Next to him were two men who looked like painters, with women who Philip hoped were not their lawful wives. Behind him he heard Americans loudly arguing on art. His soul was thrilled. He sat till very late, tired out but too happy to move, and when at last he went to bed, he was wide awake. He listened to the manifold noise of Paris. But Paris also kills some romantic illusions Philip had about life. The older artists around him are poor and have been struggling with basic survival for most of their lives. He realizes history is full of painters who never earned anything, and that he will never be a great artist, and painting for the sake of painting will not satisfy him. He's still young and insecure, so he starts to look for confirmation that he has no talent and asks others what they think about his work. And from their opinions, he creates confirmation for what he wanted all along, that he has no talent for painting. He starts to think about something more practical he could do, something that would give him a secure life. Further, Philip has some deep conversations with his acquaintances, Cronshaw, about individual and society and the struggle between the two. It injects more realism into his life. You have society on one hand and the individual on the other. Each is an organism striving for self-preservation. It is might against might. I stand alone, bound to accept society, and not unwilling, since in return for the taxes I pay, it protects me, a weakling against the tyranny of another stronger than I am. But I submit to its laws because I must. I do not acknowledge their justice. I do not know justice. I only know power. I am quits with society. For the rest, I counter its might with my willingness. It makes laws for its self-preservation, and if I break them, it imprisons or kills me. It has the might to do so, and therefore the right. If I break the laws, I will accept the vengeance of the state, but I will not regard it as punishment, nor shall I feel myself convinced of wrongdoing. Okay, I will continue with further reflections of human bondage in part 2. Until then, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.